Hi, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight for our screening of In the Name of Confucius, as well as our post-film question and answer discussion session. My name is Emily Huang, and I'm the president of Students for Falun Gong and a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. I will be the host of our discussion session tonight. As we all just saw, In the Name of Confucius is the first documentary film to expose the growing global controversy surrounding the Chinese Communist Party's Confucius Institute initiative, a Chinese language program attached to over 1,600 foreign universities and schools around the world. Articles about Confucius Institutes can be found in the news almost every day now, and with the US Senate just recently unanimously approving a bill to tighten controls on Confucius Institutes across the United States, it has become increasingly important for students, faculty, and concerned citizens everywhere to be aware of the global presence of CIs and implications of this issue on US-China relations. In the Name of Confucius examines many of the risks that Confucius Institutes can pose to our society: a loss of academic integrity, violations to human rights codes, foreign influence, and even potential infringements on national security. This screening was hosted by Students for Falun Gong, Students for Free Tibet International, Athenae Institute, and Falun Dafa clubs on over 10 college campuses across North America. Before we introduce our four panelists tonight, we would just like to invite a guest speaker, Chimay Shola, representative from Students for Free Tibet International and president of Students for Free Tibet at the University of Washington. Chimay will be updating us on what Students for Free Tibet International has been working on, including the recent closure of a Confucius Institute on the campus of Tufts University that was just announced on March 18th, as well as some other work and experiences involving Students for Free Tibet at University of Washington. Welcome, Chimay.
Hi. First and foremost, thank you so much for organizing this event. I know there's a lot of work behind the scenes, so thank you for organizing this and inviting me. And as you mentioned, and I'm not sure people know about it, but like 3 days ago, Tufts University actually shut down their Confucius Institute, their CI. And this was a product of years of collaborative effort between different groups, SFT, Uyghurs, Taiwanese, Hong Kong, and Chinese democracy advocates in the Boston area. And they actually started physically protesting on December 19th of last year. And the last protest actually was on the 13th, 2021. And there's local support as well from local city councilors, school committee board members, state representatives, and also people who represent the area at Congress, specifically Aisha Taylor and Catherine Clark, both wrote letters to the chancellor in support of shutting down the CI. So that's great. And just letting you guys know, anybody in the Boston area, that on April 3rd, there will actually be a commemorative victory protest and advocate for other causes and CIs. And I guess I'd like to also just kind of speak personally too on my experience with working with shutting down CI at my college campus. I actually go to the University of Washington as a student. I'm a senior studying bioengineering. And 2 years ago, actually, I've seen Doris's documentary, and I was kind of shocked at how the Confucius Institutes were pretty much almost growing and widespread across America. And as it's been American, and also as a student too, kind of felt kind of compelled to at least talk with the people, the administrators, school administrators. And I wrote a letter on behalf of SFT as a student, and as it's been American, why? I just want to hear out what's their side. And after countless email threads and trying to talk with the secretary and whatnot, and still they were really kind of apathetic and kind of dismissive to that. So there was a lot of pushback, not open pushback, but behind the scenes. They didn't want to make a lot of noise because any attention to this, any logical sane person would view the CI as a direct threat to academic integrity, especially, and of U.S. interests. But anyway, the University of Washington was actually in particular kind of an interesting CI scenario because there was no direct classes associated with the CI. Rather, they used University of Washington as kind of as a home base to physically have their offices at the University of Washington, but have actual programs across the state of Washington, Eastern Washington University, and Pacific Lutheran University, but with it being shut down now, it's kind of fragmented, and yeah, so.
Great, thank you so much, Chimay. And thank you for Students for a Free Tibet. So today we have the unique opportunity to hear from 4 expert panelists on Confucius Institutes, and for audience members to ask any questions that they may have about Confucius Institute's US-China relations, academic freedom, and other related topics. So tonight we are joined by Doris Liu, an award-winning documentary filmmaker and journalist based in Toronto, Canada. As a Chinese immigrant, her passion is to tell compelling stories about China and Chinese-related stories that are rarely seen, but that are essential for the world to understand its relationship with China. Doris and her team were the only ones on the front lines of the TDSB and Confucius Institute story, capturing the first cracks in the controversial CI programs. Doris has been invited as a guest speaker at the 2014 International Conference on Corporate Espionage and Industrial Security held in Ottawa, and previously won the award for the Best Multicultural TV Story for her insightful coverage on high-profile hate crimes against Asian anglers during her time as a former video journalist. Our next panelist is Dr. Perry Link, Chancellorial Chair Professor for Teaching Across Disciplines at the University of California at Riverside, and Professor Emeritus of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. Dr. Link specializes in modern Chinese literature and language and has published widely on modern Chinese language, literature, and popular thought, and is a member of the Princeton China Initiative, China Human Rights Watch Asia, and other groups that support human rights. Dr. Link's review essay on Confucius Institutes titled Confucius Murders Squirrels was published in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies in 2017. Our next panelist is Rachelle Peterson. Rachelle is a senior research fellow at the National Association of Scholars and the author of 4 NAS reports, including 2 on the threat the Chinese government poses to American education. Her 185-page report in 2017, titled Outsourced to China, Confucius Institutes and Soft Power in American Higher Education, helped spark a national movement to protect colleges from Confucius Institutes. Rachelle consults frequently with state and federal legislative bodies and regulatory agencies. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and more. Our last panelist tonight is Rory O'Connor, president and founder of the Athenae Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to limiting the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on US college campuses. Athenae advocates for free discussion of human rights abuses on campuses by pushing student governments and university administrations to close Confucius Institutes, disclose ties to authoritarian governments, and establish mechanisms and policies to prevent the Chinese regime and other authoritarian governments from encroaching on academic discourse. As a college sophomore, Rory helped organize student support for the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act and the Uyghur Human Rights Act. He has previously worked in Senator Chris Coons' office and led the effort behind the Washington Appeal, an open letter concerning the threat of authoritarian influence and the defense of public institutions. On behalf of our hosts, I would like to welcome our 4 panelists as well as our audience to the Q&A discussion panel. We welcome everyone to drop any related questions they may have about the film, Confucius Institute's academic freedom, and US-China relations in the chat box, and we will have our panelists answer them as we receive them. Before we begin our Q&A session, we would just like to invite each of our 4 panelists to speak briefly on their work involving Confucius Institute's China and China-related issues and any points from the film or their work that they may like to emphasize to the audience after the film. Doris, we would like to invite you to speak first.
Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this film and joining this event tonight. And special thanks to the organizers, the 3 organizers, especially the Students for Falun Gong group, you initiated this idea of virtual screening because of the pandemic. The last screening of my film was held longer than a year ago. So this is the very first public screening online. So thank you for organizing this event. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my co-panelists. Thank you for taking the time joining us tonight and discussing this very important issue. And I felt very honored to be the same panel as Professor Link. You are a very prestigious sinologist. And I personally, as a Chinese living outside of China, I wanted to thank you for your long time support to the Chinese people's pursuit to a free and democratic country in China. Thank you for that. So as you watch my film tonight, I think initially I wanted to explore the issue myself, because as a Chinese, I heard about the Confucius Institute, but I didn't know much about it until in early 2013. I read an article from Global and Mail, which is a major newspaper in Canada, saying that Canada's McMaster University was closing down its Confucius Institutes because the Chinese side was practicing a discriminatory hiring policy, which means they exclude any people who practice Falun Gong as their teacher teaching at the Confucius Institute. So that was the very reason that caused the very first closure of the Confucius Institute around the world. At least it's reportedly the first closure. So that was in 2013. That caught my interest immediately. And then I decided to make a documentary about it. It took me 3 years to make this documentary because I was not professionally trained as filmmaker. So it was very challenging for me to make this film just as a filmmaker point of view. And also it's a very controversial issue, even now. So it's challenging for me to get the other side of the story because it's a controversial issue. You wanted to have the pro side and a con side. But unfortunately, people who are supportive to the Confucius Institute do not want to talk about those controversies. So that was the second challenge for me in making this film. And it, as you saw from the film, I was basically stonewalled after the first 3 approaches to the universities and schools who hosted the Confucius Institute. And then after that, no one wanted to talk about this issue at all. And so throughout the process of making this film, I got great support from various communities, including the Falun Gong community, Tibetan, and China Democratic movement. So after I finished the film, I spent the past 4 years now, trying to use my film, reach out to people who have concerns about this issue. So with the help of the Falun Gong community, Tibetan, Uyghur, and some other people around the world. So now the film has been seen by people in 20 countries on 5 continents. And also the film has been translated into 12 languages, so including the Chinese and English. So I think I've been traveling with my film to meet people from grassroots, from the academia. What struck me the most is when I saw some of the educators, when they should have been defending and upholding the values of academic freedom, free speech, human rights, all the values we cherish, especially as higher educators, they should have been a champion for those values. But unfortunately, some of them are willing to sacrifice those values to the immediate interest, or pragmatic interest they would have from the Chinese Confucius Institute, from the Chinese government. And now we see the issue has been more and more severe. I mean, the issue of the Chinese government's, the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration into our educational systems, into our media, into almost every level of the society and every field of the society. So I hope from my film could be one as an educator, so bring you some information and you may not heard before, and then help you to think deeper and broader about this issue of the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration into our free society. And then hopefully this film can encourage or trigger some actions so that we can work together, like various communities, we work together to counter back this infiltration from the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doris. Next, we would like to invite Dr. Link to speak. Dr. Link.
I am unmuted. Can you hear? Okay, here I go. First, I would also like to thank Emily and her colleagues for organizing this, and especially Doris for that really moving, very good job on that film. Doris, I think you were smart to include the other side as much as you could. Your clips of the school board chair who tried to stick up for the Confucius Institute was one of the most important parts of the film, because when you show squarely what the other side says, they undermine themselves. You don't have to do it for them. Another strength of your film, and in your talk just now, is that you didn't refer to China as the other side. You consistently refer to the CCP, the Communist Party of China. This is a very important distinction for anyone trying to understand virtually anything about China these days. The Communist Party of China is huge, nearly 100 million members, but it's still a private club, really. It is a party. It's not a nation. The part of the strategy of the party is to make that distinction unclear, to pretend that we, the Communist Party, are the same as China. I was struck again with particular force watching just recently the meetings between the American Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and Yang Jiechi on the Chinese side in Alaska. Because even the media, the mainstream media in our country, which ought to know better, says the two sides. There's the China side, the US side, the this side, the that side, as if these two entities are parallel in a sense. Now, playing chess on the international chessboard, they are parallel. But as organizations, what Blinken represents and what Yang Jiechi represents are very different things. One is a democracy. And of course, our democracy is frayed. It has no perfect democracy, and the US certainly doesn't have one. But the other side is, what should we call it? A thugocracy. It's closer to a mafia organization in Western terms than it is to a government. So it's very misleading to refer to them as two more or less co-equal sides. But that is what the Communist Party of China wants to communicate constantly. The Confucius Institute's purpose is to spread the prestige around the world of the Communist Party of China. And your film is quite right to point out that this is a long-term strategy that's been going on for a while. I remember I first heard of the Confucius Institutes about 20 years ago, when they weren't really that noticeable or fearsome. And here we are 20 years later, and they will keep going as long as the world lets them keep going. The technique, fundamentally, of the Confucius Institutes is to take that distinction of China and the CCP and claim to be China and advertise that we are talking about the Great Wall and panda bears and exotic Chinese characters, delicious Chinese food, gongbao jiding, and Confucius, this wonderful old sage. In order, in the world opinion, to stimulate good feelings and then harness those feelings to pull behind the prestige of the Communist Party of China. That's why this distinction between the two is so important, because Confucius Institutes, and not just them, the whole foreign approach of the Communist Party of China tries to eliminate that distinction. There's a lot I could say about what's wrong, but I'm going to confine myself to the main point, I think, in what we have to fear in the Confucius Institutes. And that is what they omit. All right, they teach some Chinese characters, they teach some history, although, of course, whitewashed history. But what they omit, and I'll give you my list, although your film had a pretty good list. Here's what they omit. The Great Leap Famine that killed 30 million people, the Cultural Revolution, the June 4th Massacre, the Xinjiang Genocide, the crushing of Hong Kong in the last few weeks, Taiwan autonomy, Tibet and the Dalai Lama, Falun Gong, democracy, freedom, human rights, constitutionalism, Charter 08, Liu Xiaobo and the Nobel Peace Prize, and the massive wealth that has been accumulated by the leadership's families. All of those topics cannot be mentioned. I have a friend, a retired professor of Chinese history named Stephen Levine, who a few years ago did an experiment. He wrote a letter to all of the Confucius Institutes in the United States and pointed out to them that, okay, you're trying to reflect Chinese history and culture. The June 4th Massacre, by anyone's account, is a very important event in modern Chinese history. What are you doing in order to mark this event's anniversary? And from almost 300 letters, he only got one response. And that was a muted response from someone who said, we're going to try to do something, but not through the Confucius Institute. Well, that's as clear evidence as you can get that it's the omission that matters. And I'm going to end here by showing you something I've used with my students to illustrate what it means when you omit something important. I have this man, this picture. Can everybody see it? I'm going to hold it up here. And I ask my students, does this look like a good guy? Is this someone you might want to have a meal with or a talk with? Yeah, he does. Then you see what he's doing down here. He's crushing this squirrel to death. And now would you like to have tea with him? No, they all say. Of course not. Then this is the important part of the experiment. I cover up the squirrel again and show just this part. Now, what do you think of him? The same image, but now you know that what underneath he's doing. And of course, it's different. Now I don't want to have tea with him again. This is the principle that shows why the Confucius Institutes are dangerous. If they teach the message that China is all of these things that are true, basically, you can talk about Tang poetry, you can talk about writing characters, Gongbao Jiding is wonderful. But when you leave out the other parts, the audience loses twice. It loses once because the things that are omitted aren't known. And it loses again because the visible part is different if you don't know what the invisible part is. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Link. Next, we would like to invite Rachelle. Rachelle.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who are watching this panel and who watched the film. This is a very important topic, and Doris did a really excellent job putting this film together. I was really honored that one of the things that we at the National Association of Scholars got to do was help host, I believe it was the very first screening in the United States. We did it in DC back in 2017. I've been researching Confucius Institutes for the last 6 years. My organization, the National Association of Scholars, maintains, I believe, the only public database that's up to date of every Confucius Institute in the country. There are still 51 in the United States. We also have a list of all of the Confucius Institutes that have closed. There are 72 that have closed or are in the process of closing down. I want to add two brief anecdotes to Dr. Link's list of bad things with Confucius Institutes. Two anecdotes that I experienced when I was doing my research. The first was at New Jersey City University. I had the opportunity to interview the Chinese director of the Confucius Institute there, and I asked her, what would happen if a student asked a question about Tiananmen Square? What would you say? And she was quiet for a long time, but then she finally said, well, I would show a picture and point out the beautiful architecture. Clearly, that's the important thing there, that this is a tourist attraction with architecture to look at. The second was at Alfred University in upstate New York, where I had gotten permission to visit a Confucius Institute class. And I arrived, introduced myself to the teacher, confirmed that I had gotten permission from her to be at this class, sat down in the back, and about 5 minutes in, the provost of the university walked in, called me out by name, took me into the hallway, told me I was not welcome on campus. I most definitely could not visit the class, and then proceeded to round up another Confucius Institute teacher, and the two of them escorted me, one on each side, back to my car, told me I was not welcome on campus and could not come back. I shared that anecdote with a staffer for a member of Congress who said, that sounds like a little piece of the Chinese government on a college campus, which is exactly what a Confucius Institute is. That said, I'm going to submit a controversial thesis. I believe we are, at least in the United States, on the brink of a post-Confucius Institute world. In the US, Confucius Institutes are in decline. I mentioned that there are 72 that have closed or are in the process of closing. There are 51 that are still open, but many of those are on pause right now as universities conduct reviews and decide what they're going to do with their Confucius Institute. But that does not mean the threat of Confucius Institutes has gone away. Rather, many universities, when they close the Confucius Institute, are immediately opening a new center with a similar name. Often they call it a China Institute. And that institute retains many of the Confucius Institute staff, many of the teaching materials that the Hanban sent over. Sometimes it continues to receive funding from the Hanban, and it operates very similarly to a Confucius Institute, but under a different name. In other cases, the new arrangement is a little bit more sophisticated, and Tufts University, though it is closing its Confucius Institute, it has announced that it will pursue a new, deeper partnership with a Chinese university, the university that had been its partner in the Confucius Institute. This is another strategy that many universities are adopting. They're setting up these new partnerships that will in many ways mimic exactly what the Confucius Institute did. My group, the Association of Scholars, is in the middle of a study right now called What Happens When Confucius Institutes Close? And we're doing the research right now to find out how thoroughly does that Confucius Institute actually close. So I expect that we will see continued waves of closures of Confucius Institute, but the issue will not go away. It will become a little bit more complicated. The new arrangements and partnerships will be a bit more sophisticated. It will not be as straightforward partnership directly with the Chinese government, but the issue is still there, and it continues to deserve attention. So those of you who are students, if you are at a university that has closed its Confucius Institute, I urge you to look closely at what happened after the closure and see what sort of arrangement your college or university may have put in place as a replacement, and look closely at that. I think it will be quite eye-opening. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachelle. And last but not least, Rory.
Thank you for that. Apologies. I'm out in the sticks of Middleburg, Virginia, so sometimes the connection is a little bit rough. Nonetheless, I just want to thank all of the panelists here. I do have to say I feel a little bit outgunned being in the company of Professor Link, especially Rachelle, whose work really made so much of the student level efforts possible and what have you. Doris, thank you for all of the work that you've done in creating the documentary. I would say that in trying to educate other students about the nature of Confucius Institutes, there were few things that sort of came quite as handy in the sort of missionary's toolkit, if you will, as in the Name of Confucius. It's really an excellent piece, and it's very even-handed, and it's something that, especially when we see so much partisan vitriol and what have you nowadays, this is one of those issues where it's possible to have a consensus. Now, I also want to thank Students for Falun Gong for making all of this possible and coordinating it and what have you. I mean, you have all done an incredible job with it. With that in mind, what I really want to what I really want to address here has to do with really the fact that we still have to deal with the Confucius Institute U.S. Center, which is, as Rachelle mentioned, undergoing a bit of a makeover. Now, I believe that Rachelle, Pompeo, and then Athenae Institute, the bit that we're running out of dorm rooms and basement, are the three big things that have been attacked by the Confucius Institutes and some of the folks that buy into a lot of the things that they've been saying to defend themselves. The reason why I want to bring this up is because oftentimes the framing that they've used to portray attacks against Confucius Institutes have been done in terms of the politicization of cultural exchanges. Now, first of all, I mean, just speaking as a philosophy student, everything's political, But with that in mind, if you really look at it on a moral basis and you look into the rights of students and you want to understand what is necessary for the exercise of academic freedom and the conditions that allow for it to take place, you see that Confucius Institutes are fundamentally incompatible with that. And you can go about addressing really Confucius Institutes and engaging with a lot of the arguments that have been suggested by the CIs and their defenders, just watching them fall apart. I mean, as Professor Link mentioned, the arguments that they use to defend themselves really are kind of what, put them in an awkward position. Terrible paraphrasing here. But what I mean to say is, if you look at them, one of the things that I've found most helpful in sort of debunking a lot of things that have been suggested, namely I know that those who are familiar with some of the arguments that have been thrown around about Confucius Institutes, there's a GAO report that's often cited I'm sure there's a lot of eyes that are rolling right now in the audience for anyone that's familiar with it. But there's a GAO report that's often cited as sort of evidence or as the sort of final vindication of the fact that CIs are actually the sort of victim of this broad conspiracy fueled by McCarthyism and xenophobia and a desire to contain China's rise. And if you really read the report, and you go to the methodology, for instance, you actually just take it for what it is. And I say this as somebody who's actually spoken to the staffers that made the GAO report. You'll see that the whole thing falls apart. It's nonsense. It's akin to the arguments used by flat earthers. You're not going to be able to convince folks that are a part of Confucius Institutes oftentimes. You're going to have a pretty difficult time convincing university administrators to actually take any sort of action that will help limit the influence or access of CIs and folks around or that are brought on board by CIs on campus. And what I'm really getting at here is the role of students is paramount in addressing CIs. Because faculty, a lot of times, they don't have the means to address it on their own. We saw Marshall Salins, for God's sakes, a socialist, if I'm not mistaken. Again, just to highlight the fact that this really isn't a partisan issue. In 2014, he was able to pull together a lot of faculty members, and they were able to eventually force the closure of the Confucius Institute after, I believe, the local folks that were running it or what have you, they effectively didn't want to acquiesce to the pretty reasonable demands about transparency and openness and what have you that were suggested by Salins. But what we see is that, look at Tufts, for instance. It took 13 straight weeks, in addition to 3 years of pressure by, gosh, how many different communities? We have the Tibetans, we have the Taiwanese, we have the Falun Gong and Falun Dafa practitioners. How many have been speaking up about this? For how long? And yet only recently have we been able to actually make some kind of tangible progress. Now, the way that that comes around is by using whatever organizations it is that you can sort of access on your local campus. College Democrats and college Republicans are big ones because, you know, they're these big national organizations and they connect students from all over the place. Simply by explaining the situation, simply by looking into the reality of CIs on your campus, you can actually do a hell of a lot of good. Because one of the things that has, I would say, been most concerning to me and is the fact that the very people that are running these institutes are oftentimes the victims of the very things that they're perpetuating. And what I mean to say is there have been members of faculty and on the board, or folks who have served on the boards of Confucius Institutes who have literally approached friends of mine and myself personally to explain that they regretted having ever tried to assist in starting a Confucius Institute on campus. If you look into it and you just meet the reality, again, openly, honestly, sincerely, patiently, with the right motivations, you can really actively defend your rights as a student. Now, I'll try not to run the clock any longer here, but I just want to thank everyone again, and that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you so much, Rory. So now we will begin our moderated Q&A session, and we will begin taking questions from our live stream chat. Our first question is from Michael. Michael says, thanks everyone working towards the elimination of CIs in Canada and around the world. Where are the CIs in Ontario and what are their stories?
I think I can answer this question. So Ontario's province, one of the provinces in Canada, is where I live. Now, Ontario has, as far as I know, has three Confucius Institutes. They are in our capital city, Ottawa, the Carleton University, and in Waterloo, which is called MIT of Canada, Canada's MIT. And then it's also one very close to me in Seneca College in the Greater Toronto area where I live. So all across Canada, we still have 10 Confucius Institutes. No new Confucius Institutes opened after the closure of CI in McMaster, but no, only 2 closures. And all around the world, Rachelle gave us the most updated situation about United States. So we know now that in all around the world, we have roughly 10 closures. I have the number count on my film's website if you're interested in just access in the name of confuciusmovie.com. So you will have the each and every closures of Confucius Institutes around the world. So 4 in Sweden, all closed. There's no Confucius Institutes in Sweden now. 1 closure in Denmark, 1 closure in Belgium, 3 closures in France, 3 closes all in Germany as well. So that's my count. And there's no closures of Confucius Institutes in Asia or in other continents. So unfortunately, that's the overall situation. So as Rachelle pointed out in your remark, the trend is, even though the Confucius Institutes themselves are closed, the host institutions tend to maintain some sort of connections and ties with the Chinese partners. So that's still worrisome. Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is the outlook for obtaining assistance from the Biden administration in limiting the influence of CIs in the US? I think this may be for Rachelle or Rory.
I'll jump in here. So far, the Biden administration has given us no confidence that they will take this issue seriously. The Biden administration pulled the plug on a draft policy that would have required transparency of Confucius Institute contracts. But overall, the truth is we aren't sure. Here are some ways that we can watch and evaluate. First of all, if that rule on transparency gets reinstated, that will be a good sign. Second, there's a federal law, it's known as Section 117, that requires transparency, not of contracts like that rule would have required, but transparency of the amount of money coming in from foreign sources. The Trump administration enforced this rule. It remains to be seen what the Biden administration will do. And a big marker there will be whether the Biden administration will maintain the investigations that the Trump administration began into 19 colleges and universities that were out of compliance with the law. If the Biden administration continues those investigations and presses for college and universities to obey federal transparency laws, that will be a good sign. And another thing to watch for is the Confucius Act that was mentioned earlier. This is an important piece of legislation. And if that were to move forward and be signed into law, that would clearly be a good thing. I'm not optimistic about that, but those are some markers we can look for from the Biden administration.
Rory, did you have anything to add? Great, thank you. Our next question is from Christian. He asks, what do you think are other motivations outside of money that lead these institutes partnered with Hanban to remain silent and arguably ignorant on this topic? I think this may be for Professor Link or maybe Rachelle and Doris.
Okay. In our film, we saw how Sonia woke up and played an important role. But this question raises the question of whether others don't. And I think we saw in some of the demonstrators in Doris's film too, young people shouting their heads off in favor of the Communist Party of China. So this is an important question. I think we need to think about the psychology of young people is complex, as it is for all human beings. But at one level, what are those people who are yelling for the Communist Party of China thinking? Are they thinking something slightly different inside? Are they yelling because they understand but have reasons for doing a performance on the surface? Let me give a concrete example. We have young people in China who will go to the US Embassy or somewhere and protest or throw tomatoes and then go home in order to study for the GRE so they can come to the US. The psychology of people is complex, and we need to keep in mind those various levels. Let me give a fun anecdote about a Hanban official even. When I was at Princeton, a Hanban official with the vice president of Tsinghua University, the two of them, came to Princeton to talk about 学术交流, how we're going to do scholarly exchange. And I had lunch with them, and it was very elegant in the faculty club. And after the lunch, those two top officials asked me, can we go to your office in order to continue talking? I said, sure. So we went to my office, just the three of us, and one of them had to get up to go to the men's room. So I said, yes, you go out and you go down the hall, and it's the first door on your right. As soon as he left the room, the other one said, do you have a copy of the Tiananmen Papers book that you edited? And I said, yes, here. And I took it from my shelf and gave it to him. And then he said, do you have an envelope I could put it in? Manila envelope. Yes, I do. And he put it in there and he covered it before his friend came back. That shows that even at that level, people's psychology is complex. And we need to keep that in mind, I think. Don't completely give up on the ones who are pretending to be on the other side. They have their own minds underneath.
I think I had a little bit add up to Dr. Link as a Chinese myself. It's not only psychology. It's about reality, because we know the CCP use lies and fears to rule Chinese people, to make control. So all Chinese people know if they say something, anything which is different than the Chinese Communist Party's viewpoint, they will bring themselves in danger. So in public, even in some private occasions, they keep themselves safe by not saying anything offending to them. But in their heart, some of them, they know the truth to some degree. Those young people who chanting, supporting Confucius Institute in my film, I believe they are international Chinese students who study at Toronto University. And they sincerely, at that time, by the time when I was filming, I believe they sincerely believe the Confucius Institutes are a good thing. They didn't know the bad things behind the Confucius Institute. That's also a reality of what some Chinese people are brainwashed. So come back to this point. The question is, alongside, other than money, any other benefits? Why the Western universities or school boards want to host the Confucius Institute? Of course, directly, it's money, right? Because the Chinese government sends you cash money and teachers and textbooks, all the resources you need to open a Chinese language program on campus. So you get it for free. That's money. And beyond that, beyond that direct advantages, there is good relationship through the Confucius Institutes. The Western host universities or school boards bridged a good relationship with the Chinese government, because CI is branding under Chinese government. It's directly controlled, 100% controlled by the Chinese government, the CCP. So you have that good relationship. What do you make of the good relationship? For the host educational institutions, you have better chance in recruiting Chinese students to study on your campus. And coming with the Chinese students are tuition fees which are a big part of revenues of any educational institutions, right? And then also beyond this host educational institutions, you have your local community, the governments, local business sectors. They also, through this Confucius Institute, they have a better relationship with the Chinese government. Also, then they will have better chance in doing business inside China, which means making money from Chinese market. And also, hopefully for the local governments, hopefully they will draw some Chinese investments in your society. That's what I had learned along with my travel to some other countries. And like in Germany, like just now, earlier this week, I had a chat with a Dutch journalist who is doing some investigative work on the Dutch Confucius Institute. They both, in those two European countries, the CI was first, not initiated, but it was first accepted by the local governments rather than universities. So it was the local government, like municipal government. They were approached, or they approached the Chinese government with this idea of opening a Confucius Institute in my university, in my city. And then they made that decision to invite a Confucius Institute in their city, and then they bring that idea to one of the universities in their city. So like the Hamburg University, they already closed the Confucius Institute late last year. But while I was in Germany, and the CI representative had a very brave talk with me, and he said it was the municipal government, Hamburg government decided first that we want to have a CI, and then they chose one of the university in their city. So it was Hamburg University. But in so that's the sort of values the Confucius Institutes could bring to the foreign societies. So it's even beyond the universities or school boards.
On the same question, Rachelle, I remember reading one of your reports, and I remember very clearly there was this one section. I think you asked a Chinese professor, and the quote was something along the lines of, this is my livelihood. And a lot of these professors, they fear if they say something, they won't be able to go to China to conduct research, or they will be limited in some other ways. I was wondering, like Dr. Ling said, the psychology, it's very complicated. Do you have any other thoughts, insight into why some of these professors may not want to speak out?
Yes. So as the film presented, as many of you know, Confucius Institutes have an American director, or a director from the host university. So an American campus, an American director, and that is usually a professor or an administrator. At many of the universities that I did site visits at and did interviews with people, the American director was either the provost or a senior professor in the Asian Studies department, somebody who was going to have some sway over whether an individual professor would be promoted or would receive tenure. And so a recurring line that I heard from many professors that I spoke with was they felt like they could not criticize the Confucius Institute because their chances of doing well in their jobs, getting promoted, getting tenure, would automatically be destroyed if they went against this Confucius Institute that their senior professor or provost was heading up. So it really stifled their ability to speak freely and to share their concerns with their students. One professor in particular was being pressured to encourage his students to sign up for the Confucius Institute. And he didn't want to, but he did what he had to do.
Thank you. So our next question is from Wei, who asks, is there any chance to view the material that the CIs use to teach the students, or maybe has anyone actually seen the materials?
It's funny. I actually even before I immigrated to Canada, I recalled back then I didn't realize, but I recalled later I used Hanban materials to teach an American volunteer. But I didn't realize that was a Hanban material. And back then, even if I realized, I wouldn't be able to point it out what are the problematic elements, not until late. I would say the Hanban's material, all the materials used in Confucius Institutes or all across the world, they are hand-picked by Hanban. You know, Hanban, for the audiences who are not familiar with, Hanban is under Education Ministry of the People's Republic of China. It's 100% governmental body. So Hanban is under that. So Hanban will organize like Chinese universities or educational institutions to compile the textbooks under Hanban's leadership. And then they compile that and they publish those textbooks, and then they force, in many cases, at least in one case I know of, which is in France, the Lyon University 2 and 3, they once held a Confucius Institute. At first, they had a freedom to choose their own textbooks. But then Hanban became less patient, so that they forced the French university to use Hanban textbooks. And then eventually the Lyon University decided to close that Confucius. But that gave us some understand about what are the materials they used in Confucius Institutes. They are convey the CCP's propaganda elements. I'm not saying each and every pages on those textbooks are containing those propagandistic material, but in those materials, they sneak into their CCP's ideology and propaganda. So that's how they could, in one way, trying to brainwash the Westerners.
Could I make a couple of comments on the last two questions? Mr. Wei's question here about the materials. I would like to stress again that the crucial point is not that the materials themselves have falsities, although they are there. The crucial, very crucial point is that they omit so much. They omit the strangling of the squirrel. And on the previous question about fear among professors to gainsay a senior professor or a provost, that I'm sure is there. But among China scholars anyway, a much bigger fear is the fear of losing a visa to go to China. If you're a historian, you need to go to archives and do interviews. If you're a sociologist, you need to do surveys and interviews. And if you can't get a visa, your career hurts. I've been on a visa blacklist for, 25 years now. And I'm a witness to how big that fear is, because maybe on average once a month, it used to be more than that. It used to be 4 or 5 times a month. I would get questions from younger scholars saying, Professor Link, what do I need to do in order not to end up where you are? Of course, they weren't so rude as to put it that bluntly, but that was the idea. Where is the red line that I shouldn't cross because I need to protect my career? And I don't blame them for asking that question. But the point, and here their very question is evidence of the point, is that they're not going to cross the red line if they think they know where it is. They're going to self-censor.
Can I add just one thing? Yes, self-censor, that's the very big problem where the Confucius Institute is. I just give you one example. I met with German CI representative who represents the German university. And I met with some other, from other countries as well, including my own country, like Canada. Those professors, they admitted in order to open a Confucius Institute on campus, they had to agree with some unwritten unspoken precondition to the Chinese government, which is there's no talk about those sensitive topics in our Confucius Institutes. But they accepted that. Their reasoning was, okay, other part of our university, we can talk freely. So it's okay, we can talk, only not in Confucius Institutes. That's the blatant breach of academic freedom.
Thank you.
It also isn't a consistent policy, because if you asked a physicist, is it okay to put out a false version of physics? And the answer is, it doesn't matter, because there's plenty of the true version of physics there, so it's not going to make any difference in the long run. That would be ridiculous. No physicist, no anthropologist, no one in any other field would accept that argument. So why should we accept the argument that a wrong version of Chinese history is all right from the Confucius Institutes because there are other places to correct it? That's just anti-educational.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, we saw in the documentary that the supporters of CIs conflate the ideas of Chinese culture and the CI just as the CCP conflates itself with the Chinese nation. Why do people fall for this reasoning?
Well, say the question again. I didn't get the first part of it.
The question was, we saw in the documentary that the supporters of CIs conflate the ideas of Chinese culture and the CIs, just as the Chinese Communist Party conflates itself with the Chinese nation. Why do people fall for this reasoning?
It's not a fall for the reason. It's very clear as a historical fact that the Communist Party of China sponsors the CIs, pays for them, spreads them around the world. You don't have to conflate something that's already admitting what it is.
So our next question is for Rory. As a college student, what do you think the greatest damage CI brings to the US campus and society is? How do college students see the CIs in general?
Well, so I would say, just to start with how students generally see CIs, the sort of latter half of your question, if they're actually in the program, it kind of varies. If they're trying to go on a trip or something overseas, or they're sort of brought into it and they have no prior exposure to really, I suppose, Chinese language instruction at all, generally they're more likely to sort of take everything that they learn within a CI at face value. If you look at I think the perfect way to exercise this is, or to sort of demonstrate I would say the vulnerability of a lot of folks to this is in seeing who makes up the staff of the Confucius Institute US Center itself. They're all members of the universities that have attended, or they have themselves actually been through the CI programs at their own universities. With that in mind, I would say that probably the greatest threat posed by CIs to students, or I would say it has to do with self-definition is really a prerequisite for self-determination. And what I mean by that is to say that one of the things that inspired the Washington Appeal, for instance, it was driven in response to Chinese civil society. Dr. Jianli Yang, Dr. Yang, he's actually on the board of our organization because we've worked very closely on this throughout the entire process. We consulted with Teng Biao all throughout the writing of the appeal itself, because fundamentally it's about platforming and really allowing for those who are Chinese to really take a hold of their own identity. Confucius Institutes are fundamentally opposed to that very idea, because it's putting China under the termed, or it's limiting it, it's letting it be defined as an identity, as a history, as a language, as a people, as pretty much any way that you can possibly think about it. The concept of China is then taken wholly under the terms of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's the worst possible thing that you could do, because it means that all of the heinous actions that have been committed by the Chinese Communist Party are really also the same actions, or what have you, of 1.4 billion people. Now, I think that that's nonsensical, and I think that any reasonable person that really looks at it can see it as nonsense. But if you have CIs and if you have university administrators that are either ignorant, or they're, say, convinced by the sort of finances or what have you, or sort of under the threat of financial pressure, or having the cash cows cut off, then you're not going to see that. You're not going to see the full picture. It's the omission point that Professor Ling mentioned. Yeah.
Can I just respond to the previous question about the conflating? I think that is exactly the strategy used by the CCP, which is to make the strong connection between themselves, between the party and the Chinese culture. That's what we learn, like each and every Chinese who ever studied at any school level, even middle school, you need to write the text, politics, that's the name. And then in order to get past the text, you need to recite Chinese Communist Party represents Chinese culture, represents Chinese people, represents the most advanced sort of forms of humanity, that kind of things. You need to recite them. So I recited at every Chinese student in order to get past. So, which we already know that the Chinese Communist Party is just coming to being after 1921. It's just 70 years of history. But China has over 5,000 years of history. How could that represent the whole long history? And then plus, the Chinese Communist Party is totally different ideology than the Chinese philosophy, traditional history and culture is totally different. Not only different, but also the CCP destroyed traditional Chinese culture, at least during the 10-year Cultural Revolution, during like 1960s through 1970s, that 10 years. So it purposefully destroyed, cut off the traditional Chinese culture, but then it says itself represents that culture, and then they use the culture as the selling point to sell this idea of Confucius Institute to the whole world. And then people get confused by this Confucius Institute. And so the CCP knows if they pitch foreigners with its own ideology, it will totally be a failure. No one would accept. But they have to get some idea from the traditional Chinese culture, which is a treasure of the humanity, right? So they know the Chinese culture is the good thing. They have to borrow that from the Chinese culture and make themselves look like a presenter of the Chinese culture. So that is the very, I would say, effective and smart. It's very effective. People buy it, but it's totally false. Totally false.
It's worth pointing out, too, that in the history of the Communist Party of China, there were several times when they were very explicitly anti-Confucius. Founded in 1921, but in the May 4th movement, the main slogan was "Dada Kongjia Dian," down with Confucius and Sons. And then in 1973, when Mr. Mao was trying to purge the image of Lin Biao, his rival, he had a big campaign called Pilin Pikong, criticized Lin Biao and criticized Confucius. And Confucian temples were sacked and torn down as they were in the Cultural Revolution. What does that tell us about Confucius Institutes today? It's this fake cozying up to Confucius is purely for their own political power today.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. So our next question is from Christian. What do you think it would take from an international perspective for the native Chinese people to become aware of the educational hypocrisy taking place in the world compared to its failure in China?
Can you read the question again? I'm trying to conceive it.
So the question is, what do you think it would take from an international perspective for the native Chinese people to become aware of the educational hypocrisy taking place in the world compared to its failure in China?
The native hypocrisy taking place in the world, that means the accommodation of the Confucius Institutes?
I think the question is asking a little bit about how the Chinese government will spend billions of dollars internationally, but so many of its children in China go uneducated and cannot afford education. So what would you think it would take from an international perspective for the native Chinese people to become aware of this hypocrisy?
Oh, well, it would take a free press and a free internet for starters. Here again, I think the psychology of the Laobaixing, the ordinary people in China, is probably not what the Communist Party of China wants us to think that it is. Let's do a thought experiment. We have a farmer waking up in the morning in the hills of Guizhou to go out and farm his or her land. Does that person wake up thinking, I hate the Dalai Lama? No, it's miles apart. Ordinary people in China, what do they care about? Well, Doris can tell us better, and Emily. But from reading history and literature, I think what they care about is food, clothing, shelter, children's education, health. They don't wake up thinking, I want to be a nationalist on the front line and do genocide in Xinjiang and clamp down on Hong Kong. This is from the top. And this is one of the terrible things for the mistake of thinking that CCP equals China, because people in the West think that that's China's voice when Yang Jiechi talks in Alaska. And I don't think that that's what ordinary people normally think about anyway. So what would it take for them to, a free press, a free internet, just learning these facts would be important, which is why they control the internet. They know that if this were well known, they would get opposition from Laobaixing.
Yes, exactly. Take myself as an example. But I was brainwashed, right? I was the CCP member as well. But until the day I got the truth from internet, I was fortunately worked for a foreign company, and then we had a direct connection from our Chinese city, our office, a fiber connection with our American headquarters. And that fiber connection does not have blockade. It's not censored, fortunately, when I was still in China. And I searched what I have in my mind, the questions about Tiananmen Massacre. That's the very first political events in my years of China, living in China. And the second one was the persecution against Falun Gong. That's a second significant political events happening during the years when I lived in China. And then I Googled, oh, sorry, back then, I don't know, it may not be Google, but anything. I searched on internet, on that free, uncensored internet, which not many Chinese people has the good luck to have, but I had. And what I saw from internet shook me, I would say, shook me to death. Like, I couldn't believe the image of the bloody image of the Tiananmen Massacre, or the cruelty, like the torture, the ways of torture against the Falun Gong practitioners in the labor camps. And I was so speechless when I first saw that, even though I didn't really trust the CCP. Although I was a party member, but it's just a trend. It's not because you believe in CCP, you join it. It's just because being a CCP member, you can get brighter future in China. So that's the reason I joined the CCP. I didn't really believe it, but I was so shocked once I saw the truth, and I experienced that shock. And then I decided to immigrate outside of China. But I would say the key is an open mind for any native Chinese, no matter you're inside or outside of China. We saw a lot of Chinese people living outside of China in a free world, but they still have their mind in that box where the CCP shaped for them. They do not want to cross that box, get out of the box. That then, even if you have the opportunity, like Professor Ling said, you have opportunity to get access-free information, but you still confine your thoughts inside that box, which is unfortunate. So I would encourage everyone, no matter you're inside or outside of China. Inside, you use VPN to break through that internet blockage. And outside of China, you already have that freedom. So get access to the information which is different than what you were taught by the Chinese government or what you developed based on the education you got from Chinese government, and break through that box, that mindset of box, and get access and talk to people who had different viewpoints as yours, and talk to the people you thought, okay, they're anti-China. So talk to them, communicate with them, read, watch, listen, and use all ways, and think with your mind, and trying to develop some sort of logic thinking. Because a lot of Chinese people, after brainwashed by the CCP, they're thinking illogical. It's against logic. It's not logical. So trying to develop that logic thinking, and then I believe when you embrace the truth, you will have a rebirth, like I did.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Chi Sang, who asks, the US Senate passed an Anti-Confucius Institute Act on March 4th, 2021, but a similar bill was blocked by the House last year. Are there any plans to get congressional House members to take up the bill this year?
If I may. Yes, that's currently underway. For those in the audience, you're encouraged to contact your legislators, especially those in the House. I know that there are students working both at the state level. I mean, we're working the Athenae Institute, the organization that I'm a part of. We're working at both the state level and working to organize students to get support at the federal level for the Confucius Act. It's a first step. And while there's still some discussion over whether it was blocked or whether it just didn't get anywhere because it's the House, I have tried to avoid that question as best as possible, just to sort of avoid any sort of partisanship or what have you, simply because students want action to be done. University administrators are either ignorant or they're culpable, or they're just really in a position where they're so vulnerable and so exposed to having, the rows and rows and lines of cash cow students, sort of pulled out from under them or what have you. We do need action to be done by public officials, and if there's any way that you can sort of, talk with others about that. I mean, certainly students are trying to get it passed. Yeah.
Thank you. Rachelle, similar to this question, I also just wanted to ask, I know that you talked a little bit about how Confucius Institutes are getting shut down and are popping up under different names. Is there any way that this will affect any legislation that sort of specifically talks about Confucius Institutes or defines what a Confucius Institute is in their relationship to the Hanban?
That's a very important question because in addition to the Confucius Act, there have been pieces of legislation that have been passed and signed into law, especially the NDAA banning Department of Defense grants to universities with Confucius Institutes, and a bunch of state level initiatives, and some regulatory actions as well. And importantly, they have to define what a Confucius Institute is, and so they define it as a center funded by the Hanban. And this is sort of a tiny thing on paper, but it matters hugely for the effectiveness of these pieces of legislation for two reasons. One is that the Hanban has changed its name. It's no longer called the Hanban. It's now the Center for Language Exchange and Cooperation. A second reason is the Hanban is no longer running Confucius Institutes. It has recently spun off a new NGO called the Chinese International Education Foundation that's running Confucius Institutes. And effectively, this doesn't really change what a Confucius Institute is. The line between a non-governmental organization and the Chinese government is paper thin here. But in terms of our policy, that matters a lot because, again, in these pieces of legislation, Confucius Institutes have been defined either as something funded by the Hanban or funded by the China. It's technically no longer the Chinese government. So those pieces of legislation will have to be updated and amended. And further than that, they really need to be more aggressive to capture funds that are not just coming from the Chinese government, but from coming from other CCP-linked sources, including this new NGO, the Chinese International Education Foundation. So we need a lot tougher measures here. It will be tempting to begin a game of political whack-a-mole, where we crack down on Confucius Institutes and then we figure out what new name they present themselves as, and we crack down on that. But really, we need to realize that the Chinese government operates under subterfuge. It operates under a policy of camouflage, and so these will continue manifesting themselves under different names, under slightly different circumstances, and we should be more aggressive and more protective of our institutions of education.
Thank you. So our next question is from William. He says, thanks for your great film. For our local residents, in your opinion, what can we do to let more people be aware of the nature of the CI and help them to close soon?
Thanks for the question. I think each one of us can do our part. So I made the film and I'm trying to bring the film to more people. And you watch my film, you learn a thing or two. And after the panel discussion, you may have deeper thinking about this issue, and then talk to people around you, your family, your friends, your colleagues, your student, whoever you can in your circle tonight, and share with them your concern. And I would encourage, if you could, just share your concern, express your concern to your local elected officials. If you happen to have a university or school board in your city, in your community who host a Confucius Institute, and talk to your express your concern to the representatives of that university or school. Of course, individual voice may be not taken so seriously. Then you may want to find the people who have like-minded as you have, like what the Rory, your Athenae Institute, and Students for Falun Gong, and Students for Free Tibet, and try to reach out, find the people who have like share the same concerns and organize and do some campaigns. I would say it's very effective. What we saw in Boston area, I would take this opportunity to congratulate Boston area community, like Tibetan, Falun Gong, Uyghur, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and you name it, who are against the CCP regime. It took them 3 years. I know, like Laden of the Tibetan Initiative. I don't get the name of their organization, but they started their campaign in early 2018, and then they screened my film in Boston, and then they kicked off their campaign, and it took them 3 years, and first forced the UMass Boston to close the CI, and then days ago, like just Wednesday in this week, they forced Tufts University to announce the closure of its CI. It's very successful example for all of us, because I know for the people who just started to get to know the evilness of the CCP, they feel discouraged. They feel their enemy is so strong. Like the other day, I talked with the Dutch journalist. He felt not optimistic as I do. They felt like, oh, I don't know what to do to defeat CCP. They see this enemy is so strong. But I would say, look at what Boston communities has achieved. This is a very good example and can encourage all of us. And we do a little bit, do our part, and everyone do our own part. And then we get together and get our strengths together and hit it back. I believe eventually we will defeat that evil regime.
Thank you. So our next question is from Ethan. Ethan asks, another question I have is in response to things I've seen on social media about how China bashing, sorry, one second. I think the gist of the question is about how being anti-CCP, oh, sorry, here's the rest of the question. Another question I have is in response to things I've seen on social media about how China bashing is leading to anti-Asian racism in the West. I think this is a very serious concern. I think we should obviously criticize China for its human rights violations, but this can lead to suspicion and racism against people of Asian descent. How do we make sure that our criticisms of the Chinese government don't lead to racism?
First, we should make it clear that we're not China bashing. None of us is. We never have. We're CCP bashing. This is why that distinction is so important. As for the danger of there being a sort of racist reaction against all Asian people, I think in America we have to face the fact that that does happen, and we have to educate our fellow citizens as much as we can and avoid that as much as we can.
If I may add, we really need to expand. We need an expansion of China literacy in this country. I mean, funding for language and cultural education in university colleges has been cut like consistently over the past decade, and it hasn't been raised. That's something that has really provided ample ground for fertile ground for Confucius Institutes to grow. We see that they're most exploitative, that they're sort of most destructive in places where China or education related at all to China is most lacking. And it's something that we really do need to address. One of the reasons why, I believe it was Doris who made this point earlier, but Confucius Institutes have only been closed in Western democracies. That's pretty concerning, considering that Confucius Institutes are expanding in South America, all over Latin America. They're expanding in Africa, all over the place. Think of Southeast Asia, think of East Asia for that matter. It's just the only way that we're going to be able to address something like this is if we really provide some other instruction distinct from that provided by the Chinese Communist Party. And it has to be more based on the reality at hand than, you know, this sort of ossified ideological monolith that we get from the party. But that's all I have.
And oftentimes I would say those people who accuse the critics of the CCP of racist or racism are the people who, I would say, at least a friend of the CCP. I find oftentimes, not all the times, like Dr. Link pointed out, we do have a racist against the Asian or against the Chinese people in our society, but it's not the major, it's not a major issue I observed. It is precisely because of those people who confuse the Chinese and the CCP. They make them as one concept. So they express their, you know, bad feeling against the CCP towards Chinese people. That's because they didn't make this distinction. So we need to educate them. But the other people who accuse those as racist, they're purposefully. That is the card played by the CCP. Whoever dares to be critics of the CCP would be accused by the CCP as racist. So we don't need, we make sure we don't fall into that hole, a trap.
And just to reiterate what we've been saying all along, Confucius Institutes don't really portray Chinese culture or Chinese society. They portray a vision filtered through the CCP's preferences. So to be against the Confucius Institute is certainly not to be against Chinese culture. It's to be against this false and heavily edited portrayal of what that means according to the CCP.
Great, thank you so much for your answers. So that's about all the time that we have for tonight, and we would just like to wrap up with one last question that we'll ask each of the panelists, and that's sort of just one thing that you would like the audience to take away from this movie, be it about Confucius Institutes, about US-China relations, about how to move forward after viewing this and hearing all of you speak. So we'll begin with Rory. You're muted.
I'd have to say, I hate to sound so cliche, but don't lose hope. The only thing there's nothing that's certain about this. Democracy, as you know, any one person might conceive of it, is certainly not the norm throughout history. And it's also not something that's just a gift, it's exercise. It's something that you have to take hold of. It's something that you act through, in a sense. So with that in mind, with all that's going on right now, there's a place for any one person to have an impact on it. And again, I hate to sound so cliche here, but that's really the best takeaway I hope I could leave one with. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. Rachelle?
I just want to emphasize that we are entering a new stage in the battle against Confucius Institutes. They are manifesting under different names. The problem of CCP influence. The Chinese government seems to be moving away from Confucius Institutes in the West and towards these other forms of partnerships and other forms of improper influence. So while we should celebrate the closure of the Confucius Institutes, we should be aware that this battle is far from over.
Thank you so much, Rachelle. Dr. Link?
From the broadest possible historical perspective, I think we have an odd sort of grounds for optimism. And that's that if you look at the 3,000 plus years of recorded Chinese history, there have been 3 times when a government has been very centralized, powerful, violent, built walls, the Great Wall originally, and now this internet wall. And those 3 times have been the Qin, before the Han Dynasty, 220 BC, and the late Sui in the 7th century, and the Communist Dynasty. Those two previous dynasties didn't last long. Qin only less than 30 years, the Sui less than 100 years. The Communist Dynasty has now lasted 100 years, almost. But I don't think that it can overpower the long sweep of Chinese civilization. So history is on our side.
Thank you so much, Dr. Link. And Doris?
I would again take this opportunity to thank the organizers and all the panelists, and thank each and everyone who watched this late. I would just say keep hope and be optimistic as I do. Even as a Chinese, I believe eventually we will, like, truth and goodness will prevail, not the evil force, not in any chance. So, but maybe during the process, there are ups and downs, and maybe sometimes you see the evilness prevail for temporarily, but in the long run, we will prevail and do our part. Like, if you can reach one people, just reach out to them, to that one person, and tell them what you learned, and be persistent. This is very important. Be persistent. Keep on doing what you think is good and it's righteous thing. And last thing is, if you want to educate more people about this issue particularly, and you want to share my film, just send a link to the film to your friends. And my film is available on a lot of digital platforms now. So you can just Google. Yeah, it's on YouTube, Movie, Amazon Prime, and I don't remember, it's the distributor's work. But anyway, you can share my film with them. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Students for Falun Gong, Students for Free Tibet International, and Athenae Institute, we would just like to thank all of our audience for joining our movie screening and Q&A panel discussion tonight, and especially to our 4 panelists, Doris Liu, Professor Perry Link, Rachelle Peterson, and Rory O'Connor, for joining us for this wonderful and thought-provoking discussion. Like Doris mentioned, In the Name of Confucius is available to stream on multiple platforms for anyone who may have missed it or who would like to share it with their family and friends. Thank you for joining us. Good night, everyone.
Good night.